All right, everyone. It looks like we've got everyone in from the waiting room, so we're going to get started. Good afternoon. Welcome back to our monthly Lunch and Learn webinar for our Fall 2022 series. Today, we're going to try and answer that question, can you be richer than you think? I'm Sonja Hodis, one of the many directors at CCI Huronia and a condo lawyer, as well as your moderator today. Joining me today on the panel is Blair Spinney, who is a condo auditor and accountant, and he's the treasurer of our chapter. We also have Ryan Griffiths, who's the director of condominium finance at CWB Maximum Financial and a director at CCI Huronia. And we have Thomas Martin, who is the director of business development for Swtch, which is a company that provides electric vehicle charging services to condominiums. And we have Ephram Spielman, who is the chief revenue officer for Carma Corporation, which is a national submetering and billing company. So today we are going to be talking about money, which is a topic that gets every condo owner and a director's attention. But we're going to look at this from a variety of different perspectives and hopefully open your mind to ideas on how to better manage the ongoing costs of your condominium. First off, we're going to take a look at budget, which is really the cornerstone of knowing how much money you are going to need to run your condo. Many of you are coming up to your year ends and you're starting to work on your budgets. So Blair is going to take you through the do's and don'ts of preparing your budget and how to read a budget. And then we're going to move into a discussion with Ryan about the financial challenges condos are facing and his thoughts on how to manage these. And then we're going to move over to electric vehicles. This is becoming a frequent topic around boardroom tables, and we often get questions in our chat box, actually, and after our webinars about EV charging stations. So today we thought we would bring that topic into this webinar. It's a big expense when you're installing EV charging stations. So we thought it would be great to have Thomas come join us today and talk about the options that are available and how you can deal with those costs. And then rounding out our discussion, we have Ephram, who's going to join us to talk about submetering in condos and how condos can use this tool to manage their utility expenses. And if you stick around to the very end, we've got a surprise guest for you who is going to have some recommendations about a line item that you should be putting into your budget that you probably never even thought about. So you'll have to stick around to the end. Find out who that is and what that line item shall be. But before we dive into our topics for today's webinar, I want to take this chance to thank a very special group of people, and those are our sponsors. As I've said before, without our sponsors, we are not able to put on these webinars free of charge for all of you. So thank you to our sponsors. I'm just going to share my screen. We have Common Ground Condo Law, Macintosh Perry, Bayshore Property Management, Aaliyah Associates, and MCRS Property Management. If you want any more information about the sponsors, you can just go back to our website where you registered for this webinar, click on their logo, and that'll direct you to their website where you can find out more information about them. Also, I just want to make sure, in case this is your first time with us, you know who CCI is. We are the Canadian Condominium Institute, and we are an independent nonprofit organization that was formed in 1982. We are celebrating our 40th birthday this year, so happy birthday, CCI. We have chapters across the country, 8 alone in Ontario, and CCI Huronia is one of the Ontario chapters. Our main objective is education. However, we also advocate for condos, and we represent all of those involved in condos, from owners to directors to professionals, and we encourage these stakeholders to work together. If you're not a member of CCI, check out cci.ca, which is our national website for a local chapter near you, or you can join CCI Huronia, and we would love to have you. You can go to ccihuronia.com and sign up for membership right directly on our website. In addition, you can check out the National Resource Center on our website. There's a link to the National Resource Center. This is a great resource of material that is available to you, and it's material from across the country from our various chapters on condo-related issues. Also, you will find our Condo Buzz newsletter on our website, so if you haven't checked it out, that's a great place to check it out. But if you'd like to get on to our mailing list to make sure you get notice when that newsletter is posted, make sure you send an email to admin@ccihuronia.com. Ask to be put on our mailing list, and then you'll know right away when those newsletters are posted. And if you've missed any of our other webinars, recordings of past webinars are found on our website under the resource content tab. Make sure that when you watch them, you can watch them in the YouTube channel, subscribe to our channel, hit the thumbs up to show us that you like it, and feel free to share those videos with anyone. In terms of the webinar today, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website next week. If you do not want your image recorded, please shut your video off. Also, we ask everyone to mute themselves so that we can get a nice clear recording of the webinar. In terms of questions, if you've been to one of our webinars before, you know that our chat box is always open. You can put questions into the chat box and the speakers will try during the webinar to answer those questions. And if they can't, we'll try and get to them at the end of the webinar. And finally, just our normal disclaimer, the information that is being provided today is general information. It may not apply to your specific fact situation. So if you're a condo director and you want to use the protection of Section 37 of the Condominium Act, you need to get an opinion about your specific situation from your own professional. The webinar is not intended to provide you with opinions that protect you under Section 37. In addition, because this webinar is recorded and somebody may be watching it on a day other than today, the information in this webinar is current as of November 18th, 2022, and all references to the Condo Act or other legislation during the webinar are references to Ontario legislation. All right, so let's get started. We're going to start off with Blair, but before we do, Blair, one more thing I wanted just to remind people of is there is a handout that was sent out with the email that you got reminding you about the webinar today. And it's also posted on the website. So if you can't find the email, you can just go onto our website, ccihuronia.com, click on events, click on upcoming events, click on today's webinar, and there's a blue here button that you can click to get this handout. And it's a sample budget that Blair is going to be referring to at some point during his presentation. So if you want to pull it up separately on your screen or print it and look at it on paper, you're free to do so. We thought that might make it a little bit easier for you. So Blair, take us away into a deep dive of the world of budgets.
Thank you very much, Sonja. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So yes, budgets are very important. And like Sonja said, this is the time, if you're coming up, if you're a December year end, you're probably should be into that process now of developing a budget. So why is it important? I guess, first of all, you need to determine your fees, the amount of money you're going to collect from owners for the next year. Some other things you might also want to consider is that it's very important to control your spending, and having a budget monitoring the spending throughout the year is an important way to control spending, and it's also an internal control. So that's something that we as auditors really go on and on about, but it's important that these kind of internal controls where you are the director have the monitoring that you do actually is something that we rely on as auditors as oversight over the operations of the corporation. So we're going to go into the details of developing a budget. And then we're going to get into monitoring a budget, and the two actually go hand in hand. So it's important to keep that in the back of your mind. So the process, first of all, I'll start off with the don't. Don't just take last year's fees and add a percentage. And that's your starting point, and we'll just make all the other numbers kind of play out. It's important that you consider all your expenditures to make sure that there's no surprises throughout the year. And the more you put into the process of building a budget from the bottom up, the more you'll get out of the process. It'll also help you with monitoring. So let's get into the positive. What you want to do is start early. And probably the first thing you want to do is gather information. So you'd want to get all your contracts. You probably have a carry forward schedule of contracts. So you've got your current ones and you've got expected renewals. You want to get a breakdown of your current expenditures with your current financials, and a copy of utility bills, and of course, very importantly, make sure you have your reserve fund study and your notice of future funding. So that's all, and that will actually give you the easiest number for your budget, because basically you're just going to take the reserve fund study or your notice of future funding and put in next year's contribution to the reserve fund in your budget, and there you've got one of the largest numbers into your budget. So the next step would be to prepare a projection of the current year. I'm going to share my screen a little later and we'll take a look at what that will look like. But that process is important to analyze the current year, and we'll talk about the process of monitoring as we go along. The breakdown expenditure, it's important to maybe compile and look at your expenditures based on the nature of the cost. So you're going to have your fixed costs, and this is where the contracts come into play. So you'll have your landscaping, HVAC. So when you're looking at renewal, so you'll be able to basically get your contracts, your numbers for your contract amounts right off the contracts, whatever the escalation amount is for the upcoming year. And if you have renewals coming up, consider inflation. Now, of course, in the times we're in now, that can be a big factor. All the suppliers are having difficulty getting staff, so that's really playing a big impact, especially in Huronia, where you already have difficulty getting vendors, and now these vendors are out there trying to get staff to service their clients. Another category we'll have to look at is the annual costs. So these are things you're going to probably negotiate or renew on an annual basis. So this would be things such as insurance, the audit, financial audit, and inspections of elevators and whatnot, safety, fire inspections, those kinds of things you'll be getting quotes for, or looking at industry trends. Right. So we're talking about the nature of the costs, and we talked about the fixed costs. We talked about the long-term contracts. We talked about the annual costs. Now we're going to talk about the variable costs. So these are costs where it's a function of two different variables, and a big example of this will be utilities. So here you would probably look at, it's a function of the rates that are currently in play and the consumption. So here you would probably, the best way to look at it is usually you'd pick the current rates, and then you'd look at maybe the historical trend of consumption to make sure that you're covering off this amount. Typically, we would use the current rates, but in this environment, utilities are definitely going up. So you might want to consider a bit of an increase in that variable in the upcoming year and years to come. So that's our variable cost. Also, you can consider what is a planned and expenditure as well as your unpredictable one. So repairs is something that's good to have a breakdown here. We talked about contracts, so it's good to have, like, in your internal financial statements, contracts should be separated, especially if it's a large number. So that way, once you pull out the contracts, that gives you a lot smaller number to deal with as far as developing a budget. So you'd separate your planned repairs and small improvements. So those are things that would be more discretionary in nature. And you would also look at the past history. So you would look at, well, what sort of history you've done on the more unpredictable repairs to get a number. Also, in the past history of repairs, you might want to consider a contingency. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the contingency. So a contingency would be more for these unpredicted repairs. It's also important to have a contingency set aside for extra legal costs. It could also be there to cover off increased in utility rates and or consumption. So if you set aside, and it might be able to break that, when you're developing the budget, it's good to break down, like we'll set aside an extra contingency for legal, so much for repairs. And that way, if you go over on any one of them even more than you planned, you might be able to make it up in another category. Another factor to consider in developing a budget is your accumulated surplus in your balance sheet. So what that number is, it's a little bit confusing. If you look at the balance sheet, it's basically your total assets of the corporation less your liabilities. And that's further broken down. There's a large chunk of that will be set aside for your reserve fund. And whatever's not set aside in a specific fund is your general operating fund. Another way to look at it, of course, is really what it is your accumulated surplus, just as the word suggests, from year to year. So if it's $100,000, it's $100,000 that's accumulated from the beginning of the corporation. Year over year, you've got a surplus in one year, a deficit in the next. That's all added up to that $100,000. So that surplus is important to basically like a contingency to make sure you've got enough money set aside to finance your operating assets and ensure you're able to meet your payables when due. Also, if you have, for instance, if you've got costs that vary throughout the year, seasonal costs, you'll want to make sure that you've got that money set aside to be used at those points in time. So those are all the sort of costs that you want to consider when you do your budget. So now we're going to take a look at. Let's just see if I can now share my screen. Here we go.
And anybody looking for that handout in the chat box, you'll see a link to the handout in the chat box if you need some help getting it.
There, is that okay, Sonja? Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So here we have an example of this is a monthly financial statement. One comment here is that the better job you do in developing your budget, the easier it is to monitor throughout the year, and the better job you do monitoring your financials throughout the year, the easier it is to budget at the end of the year. So the two go hand in hand. It's kind of a circular process. You want to be reviewing your financial statements on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on the size of the corporation and the risks and variances involved. So if we look at this example here, we've got current month amounts, and we've got year-to-date amounts for both the actual, the budget, and we've got the variance, the difference between the two. So we've got that both current, year-to-date, and then we've got total budget for the entire year, and then we also have a projected year. So as we go throughout the year, you don't change your budget. Your budget is fixed. It's the number that you use to develop what the fees are. But the projection can change, and it's not really necessary to do that projection throughout the year, but you certainly want to have that maybe a month or two before the year end to help you develop the budget for the following year. So here we have some variances for the current month and some year-to-date variances. So the negative variances where we've overspent in a large amount, say here, general and admin, is this a timing thing or is it an unexpected expenditure? So you want to be able to explain those variances. And the positive variances, although that's all fine and good, but, the larger ones, you might want to say, ask the question, have we recorded all of our expenses? Have we paid all our bills? Have the invoices all been recorded? So that's important to consider when you're looking at the positive variances. And then overall, you're looking at the end of the year, we've got a year-to-date variance, positive variance. We expected at this point in the year to be in a deficit, but we're actually in a surplus. So that's all good. And the way the year is projecting out is also a surplus. So that's a nice scenario to have. So that's basically budgeting in a nutshell. Another thing to consider is that budgeting also applies to your reserve fund. So the plans of the corporation may change since the last reserve fund study. So you want to make sure you're comparing the actual expenditures with those that are in the study, just to see if what kind of variances are there, and also compare your projected balance with the study. And that way, at the end of the year, you go to your annual general meeting, an owner says, you expected to have, 50,000 or 100,000 in the reserve. We've only got 50. Then you'll have an answer. We did one of these projects earlier, and that will, that'll set us. That way, you'll know and be in control of the situation. So that's it for me, and I think I might be a minute or two early.
Well, that's good because we have a question for you, Blair.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for that overview. And, it seems like everything else in life, the more that you do the work up front and get set up, the better and easier it will be as you go through the year. So the question we had was the directors, this is the comment, the directors have for many years used previous fees collected to offset the upcoming year's budget costs. To me, this obscures the real cost of your condo's operating expenses. Could you comment on this kind of situation?
So previous years, actually, maybe if I see the comment, I can get my screen.
You won't see it because it's to me directly. It says the directors have for many years used previous fees collected, and that's in quotations, previous fees collected.
So I think that may be referring back to the idea that, you've got an accumulated surplus. You collected these amounts in the prior year. You didn't have to spend them all. So now you've got a surplus. And so really what you're doing is now using that surplus to reduce the fees in the current year. And that goes back to my comment about, having that operating surplus. And having a surplus is important because, that's financing your payables. And it's there as a contingency for seasonal expenditures, as well as items that totally unexpected that come out of the blue. And that does happen no matter how much you prepare, right? So it's important to have that surplus. And you can sort of, massage your that increase year by year but I wouldn't reduce my fees in any given year just to use up a prior year surplus, because once you use up that surplus, what are you going to do the following year? You're going to have to make up that difference. So you're going to reduce or keep fees lower in a given year. And then next year, you're going to have to increase fees 10 or 15% to make up for the difference that, the expenditures have increased over those 2 years. So I guess that's my comment. Don't reduce fees. There's my do and don't. Don't reduce fees, and be careful if you're keeping your fees at a level amount, because it may not be sustainable.
Thanks, Blair. All right, so we're going to move on now to Ryan. And Ryan, in the financing business, you see lots of financial challenges that condos have. Can you share with us what you're seeing and what your thoughts are on what condos can do?
I can. Thanks, Sonja. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. So look, as Sonja mentioned, we provide loans and lines of credit and mortgages for condominium corporations and strata corporations across the country. So we see a lot of financial statements from condominium corporations. We see when condominium corporations have a shortfall. We see where they have a surplus. Everything Blair's talking about from budgeting rings true. So a couple of things to note on his last presentation. Blair touched on reserve fund budgeting. If you're doing a major project, make sure you compare the cost of that project to what you have budgeted. Always go back and look. That's your budget. That's your tool. That's what you've been saving for. Sometimes condos miss that step. So what I'm going to talk to you a bit about, I'm going to sort of talk about the theme here today was, could you be richer than you think? And I think historically, I've worked with hundreds of condominium corporations to help them be richer than they thought and find money. Maybe they were saving money for a major project and they were able to use the money they were saving then to do the work and maybe use that money to finance the project. So historically, there have been situations where condos are richer than they think. Today, I think my answer to that question today is probably not. And I'm going to walk you through why I think that's the case. There's an alarming trend right now. So condominium corporations need additional funding. And there's two buckets here where they need additional funding. So it's one in the short term. So if I'm a condominium corporation and I'm embarking on some type of major project, I'm going back to my reserve fund budget. As Blair mentioned, I'm saying, holy cow, this is not what we were planning on. And I'm going to talk you through why that is. So that's number one, a short-term need for money. Number two is the long-term need for additional funding. So this is the need to increase your operating budget and your reserve fund contribution for future expenses. And this is quite significant. So I'm gonna sort of lead you into what the culprit is, or the main culprit of that. So I'm gonna share my screen. The biggest driver today, in my experience, I'll just make sure that this pops up. So you guys should be able to see this diagram. So I think this is the biggest culprit today. And what this is this is a chart of the Statistics Canada or StatsCan Residential Building Construction Price Index. So this is an index that measures the cost of residential building construction. So this is primarily new construction. What we're dealing with in condominium corporations is restoration or remediation. So this isn't perfect, but it's the closest benchmark I can find. So it's very similar. You still hire a similar contractor to do major repair and remediation as you would to build a new residential building. What this chart says is that this starts in Q2 2020, so before the pandemic, to Q2 2022. So I've purposely taken a 2-year look, and it's measuring the cost of residential construction at that point in 2020 to 2022. And I've highlighted Toronto as the nearest metropolitan area. What this chart says is that between 2020 and 2022, in that 2-year period, the average cost of construction, as measured by this index, has gone up 55%. So put that in context, right? Well, a project that was $1 million is now $1.55 million on average. So some projects are going to be on the higher end of this range. Some are going to be on the lower end of this range. And that's over a 2-year period. So, if that continues, that's 27.5% a year increase in cost. What about over 3 years? Is that 82.5%? So that data isn't out yet. But this gives you an idea of how much additional money it costs to do a major project for a condo corporation. And you won't know what the real number is in your situation unless you've tendered out a project 2 years ago, and then you're tendering the same project out today. But I can tell you that these types of situations for corporations embarking on major projects are happening all over the place. I've probably got a dozen calls in the last 6 months for someone, say, doing a window replacement. And they go much the same. Our corporation's been saving for window replacement. We were budgeting it to be $6 million for our high rise, and we've now tendered it, and it's $12 million. So quite alarming. So now this is one part of your budget as a corporation, right? So your condominium corporation budget comes in two parts. You have your operating budget to save for, landscaping, property management, your regular day-to-day operations, and you have your reserve fund contribution to save for major repair and replacement. So I think this type of construction inflation applies to your reserve fund piece. So if we say that major construction has gone up 55%, and let's say over 2 years, let's say your last study was done 2 years ago. So if we say that major, and often they're done every 3 years, so it could be more. But for argument's sake, let's say that the cost of major construction has gone up 55%. Very superficially, doesn't that mean that I should be saving 55% more into my reserve fund? Right? If the cost has gone up 55%, doesn't that mean I should probably be putting 55% in more if I'm going to have adequate funding on a long-term basis when it comes to doing these projects? So I think it does. And what's happening is corporations that are updating the reserve fund study now are really feeling the effects of the fact that everything they've budgeted for in the next 30 years, if that's the horizon of the study, all of those costs are being increased in your plan, and the need to put more money is being increased significantly. So we're going to look at what that looks like. The other piece of your budget is the operating budget, a lot of what Blair was talking about. So I don't think you're seeing this kind of pressure on your operating budget, but let's say for argument's sake, your operating budget should go up by CPI, somewhere around 6, 7, 8%. It's been fluctuating lately. So let's say for argument's sake, CPI measures a broad basket of goods and services, and you should expect to have to raise your operating budget because your landscape contractor needs an increase. The management company needs to increase. Your insurance needs to increase. And let's say that benchmark is 7.6%, because that's fairly close to what inflation CPI is today. So what does that look like when you actually go to do your budget over the next few years? So those two parts I talked about, we're going to say that the reserve fund contribution needs to increase by that 55%, but you have 3 years to do that increase, which is typical in updating your reserve fund study. We're going to say that your operating budget increases by 7.6% this year, current level of inflation or CPI, and then maybe that tapers off over the next few years. This is a typical budget just broken down to operating and reserve. So for 2022, I'm townhouse. Of my budget of $475 a month, $309 goes to pay my operating expenses, and $166 goes to my reserve fund contribution. So next year, we're going to increase that by 7.6% on the operating side. So the operating goes from 309 to 332, and the reserve goes from 166 to 192. It goes up by 15.7%. So that's sort of 1/3 of this 55% increase. I'm going to increase this gradually over 3 years. That raises fees from $475 a month to $525 a month. The following year, even if the inflation on your operating budget comes down a bit, you still have to increase that reserve fund contribution. Those same fees go from $525 a month to $568 a month. The following year, those fees go to $610 a month. So over a 3-year period, that's a 28% increase in your condominium fees, right? So over 3 years, an average townhouse here sees their fees going from $475 a month to $610 a month. And this is driven entirely by the long-term need to increase your operating budget and increase the money you're putting in your reserve. I don't think people are prepared for this type of increase in their condominium fees. It's really dramatic. And I'm not showing anything here that's not out of kind of the norm or the average. So if you take the same numbers and apply it to a high-rise building, so a high-rise today pays $750 a month in fees, $525 goes to operating, $225 goes to reserve. If we increase those over the next 3 years, the condominium fees on a monthly basis for this unit owner go from $750 a month to $950 a month, a 26% increase. So my worry is that condo owners aren't prepared for these types of increases. And I think this is the type of pressure that we're actually going to see over the next few years for condominium corporations, based on the escalating CPI, and general operating increases, and really more so the amount of additional money that these reserve fund studies are going to call for in order to have adequate funding. So fairly scary stuff, I think, when you start drilling into the numbers. So I'm gonna stop sharing that. So what do you do, right? How are you going to manage that? We see these types of situations all the time, and it's almost like a financial crisis, right? Those are long-term financial crises. We also see what's happening today is that these corporations are tendering work, and they're realizing that it's much more expensive than they had planned. So you're going to see, if you have to go to your owners and you need additional funding for work, you're almost going to see them go through, if you Google like the stages of grief, right? And you can actually see a community go through this. So they go through denial, they go through anger, they go through bargaining, they go through depression before anybody can get to acceptance. So there's some things you can do with your community to try to manage that. So some tips to manage that, right? Try to be as transparent as possible with your owners. If you know that there is a need for additional money for some type of near-term work, when you find that out, once you know there's an issue, start communicating. Even if you don't have all the answers, start communicating with your owners early. Share with them that you've identified something and you're working on a solution. You don't need to have all of the options, and then keep them updated along the way. If you know that there's going to be a big increase in your budget, tell people before you send out that budget. If you know mid-year, give them an idea that that's coming. Be prepared to evaluate all of your options in terms of, what different options do we have to do this repair work? Can we delay it? Can we not? What do those costs look like? If you need additional funding, what does an assessment look like? What does a loan look like? What does it look like financially if we defer that project? So I think the natural tendency for a lot of communities is that if you're faced with some sort of financial challenge or shortfall, the first thing that they want to do is defer it. Let's push it out. Let's not do it now. If we don't do it now, we don't have a problem. The problem is, under the current legislation, deferring work also means you need to save for that work. You can't just defer it. You need to plan to have the money when it comes around to actually doing that work. So, and I think it's easy to think that if we just don't do it now, that it'll ease the pain. And I don't know that it necessarily will. And I'm going to show you why. How are we doing for time, Sonja? Are we good?
Yeah, you're still good.
Okay. So what happens when a condominium corporation defers work is that the cost of that project still needs to be planned. And you need to apply some type of reasonable inflation rate to the cost of that project. So if the cost of $1 million project in this table, we're going to focus on the top part. If I have a project that costs $1 million and I'm not going to do it today because I don't have the money, I'm going to push that out 3 years. If inflation stays at 10%, which I think is pretty realistic for construction inflation, the cost of that project is now going to be $1.331 million 3 years from now. And I'm going to need to save between now and then that $1.3 million in order to, or I'm just going to have the same problem 3 years from now. And if I'm a reserve fund study planner, I'm going to have to put in a good budget for that. And you're going to have to raise your fees or find a way to save that money to do it in 3 years. If I push the work out 5 years from now, let's say inflation, the average inflation cools down a bit at 6%, it's still going to be over $1.3 million. If I push it out 10 years, and even if inflation comes down to 4%, that's $1.5 million. And between now and then, I'm going to have to find a way to save that money, or I'm going to get there to do this work, and I'm going to have the same problem that I don't have enough money. So we see corporations, realistically looking at deferral. Sometimes they're looking at doing the work now and borrowing it, and sometimes it actually becomes cost effective. The reason for this is inflation compounds every year. So every year, if it's $1 million and you add 10%, so it's a million $1,010,000. Every year it compounds on that, or $1,100,000. Sorry. The next year that 10% compounds on the $1,100,000, and so on and so forth. So every year that number just keeps getting bigger and bigger. In a loan scenario, some corporations are choosing to do the work and pay that loan back. Even if the interest rate's higher, it gets paid back on a declining balance. So each month, the interest rate's getting applied on a lower balance. So all that bottom table does is compare, sometimes it's actually more cost effective to do the work and pay it off over that period of time on a declining balance than it is to continue to save for something where those goalposts keep getting pushed out year over year, and the cost of that work just keeps getting more expensive. So some kind of sobering stuff here. There are options for condominium corporations that are looking to do major work, and I'll kind of talk a bit about what those options look like. So number one, a condominium corporation can do a special assessment, right? They can go to all of the unit owners, and everybody has a requirement to pay their portion of that cost. It's not something that requires a vote under the Condominium Act, and sometimes that's the right approach. Two, if the need isn't immediate, sometimes corporations can increase their condominium fees, right? And in those scenarios where that project's being deferred, maybe that's the right approach. Maybe the approach is that we are going to plan to do this in 3 years. We're going to plan an appropriate inflation to that number, and we're going to raise our fees in order to get that work done in the next couple of years. Some other corporations are turning to loans in order to do the work. It may or may not be a viable option depending on the situation. In those cases where corporations are turning to loans, what I'm seeing more of today is corporations going to their owners and giving them an option between paying an assessment or making additional loan payments to the condominium corporation. So historically, we didn't see as much of that, particularly in Ontario. But more corporations are saying, look, we're stuck in this situation. Let's give owners a choice. Let's give them a choice to pay it off and raise the money personally, or let's give them a choice to make loan payments to the condominium corporation. But I think it does come down to choice. So we're seeing condominium corporations going to their owners and laying out different options and giving the owners a choice in terms of how to raise that money. I think the reality is that the need for additional funding is very common right now. It's more common than it ever has been. More corporations are going to start facing this because of those pressures on inflation and construction costs. So, look to your property manager, look to your lawyer, look to your engineering partner, look to a financial partner to help you kind of navigate that process. There are options out there, but for sort of, for all the reasons and data that I've described, I think this is just becoming more and more of an issue in the condominium sector. And I think one that's impacting more condos than it really ever has before. So I know that's not the best news that anyone wants to hear. I think the best thing we could do as an industry is find a way to get this information from the boards to the owners too, to give you guys some relief, because I know that you're going to be the one bearing the brunt of delivering this news to your owners that may not have the same appreciation and understanding. So I think as an industry, we just need to make sure people are well informed and they know what's driving these types of pressures.
Thanks, Ryan. And although there was a lot of doom and gloom in there, I think there is a positive note that came out of what you were talking about. And, in answer to the question that we have, can you be richer than you think? One of the messages I kind of got from your presentation is that you can, if you plan, and look at the various options. And deferring may not be the best option, although it might be the first instinct. There's a lot of other options available that might actually make you richer than having to pay those inflationary costs down the road. So thanks for that and giving us that insight. Okay, so switching things over to electric vehicles and charging stations. Thomas, can you give us some overview in terms of what options are available for condos? What are the costs looking like? And how can condos, you can't avoid the cost, somebody has to pay them, but how can condos use the options that are available to sort of either defer the cost to someone else or make it more cost effective for the condo to install these stations? Because we know electrical vehicles are becoming more and more popular. So Thomas?
Thanks for the introduction, Sonja. Everyone can see me, hear me all right? Good to go? All right. Nice to meet you all, or meet you all virtually. My name is Thomas Martin, and I'm the Director of Business Development here at Swtch Energy. which is a Toronto-based company that specializes in electric vehicle charging. We operate nationally as well as in the US, but our headquarters are here in Toronto. So if you're a Toronto condominium, I would say you would get a premium service, as we've got about 50 employees here in Toronto, and we've got plenty of resources available to help the building out. When looking at electric vehicles and the emergence of electric vehicle charging in parking garages, we need to first understand how drivers or a condominium resident behaves when it comes to charging their vehicle. The wide understanding for the general public tends to equate the gasoline model to an electric vehicle, where you want to pull up, fill your vehicle up, and move on with your day. But for electric vehicles, this is not the case. You can think of electric vehicle charging as a similar behavior as when you charge your mobile phone. It often charges at night when we're sleeping, and there isn't as much a priority of how fast it charges, because the expectation is that the vehicle is full by the morning when you wake up. Same applies with electric vehicles. The drivers will be plugging in the evening when they get home from work, when they get home from running their errands, whatever it might be. And the expectation from the driver is that no matter how much they drove that day, the next morning that vehicle is full and ready to go, whether it's on a short trip or even a long trip. So that style of thinking, or that understanding of the user behavior, is what helps the condominium and the board determine what is the required infrastructure or support we need to have in the building. And I'll break that down in a minute. Now, if you look at any building built in the last 40 years, or even more than that, they've gone through a number of different phases with respect to how they deal with energy. 20 years ago, there was a big shift towards LED lighting, as well as more efficient appliances. And that leaves a little bit of overhead energy capacity available to install electric vehicles. That being said, these buildings were not designed to have electric vehicle chargers in the basement. And my point here is the scale of how much energy a vehicle consumes is significant. Just to put this into perspective, if you are a condominium owner and you have electric heat, you have a TV, you have an electric oven, and you buy an electric vehicle, your single most dominant load that you will use as a person will be your vehicle. I know myself, I lived in a condominium for about 10 years and I drove an electric vehicle. It was representing more than 50% of my electrical consumption as a resident. So just to put that into perspective, it's equivalent or as significant as adding a completely new unit in that parking space. This might sound daunting and intimidating, and it might push you to think, well, our building doesn't have the capacity, period, end of story. This isn't the case. The good news is there's technology in the industry that allows the building to control when people charge. Now, if you look at that analogy I explained earlier, where you plug in when you get home from your day and the expectation is that you're fully charged by the morning, that gives us a very large window of opportunity to charge your vehicle. So rather than prioritizing the speed at which it charges, we can start to look at things like controlling when that vehicle starts charging to potentially share power amongst multiple different electric vehicles. And now I'm just as I'm thinking out loud here, Sonja, if it's okay, I did want to share a quick diagram.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I think this will just help visualize when vehicles would charge. And so if you look at this very basic graph, You can see, around 5 or 6 p.m. when, majority of people get home, they start using their lights, they start turning on their TV, their oven. The building goes through a bit of a wave of when it consumes energy. And then if we look at on the left-hand side, where it's the middle of the night between midnight and 6 a.m., our loads are very low because people are sleeping, the ovens aren't on, lighting may not be on, etc. So the point I'm trying to drive home here is that as a condominium, you want to be able to control when people charge, which would allow you to go to the second graph and charge vehicles during the night and well into the night. And the point here being there's a lot of different benefits. And you're probably wondering, how does this tie into finance? The goal of controlling when people charge their vehicles is to reduce the capital expense in installing these devices in the building. If we were to proceed with a system that does not have the capability to control, we're going to have to put in, $200,000 worth of electrical infrastructure. But the problem with this is you would think of it as putting a large engine in a small vehicle. You're not going to use it. So you want to take advantage of the off-peak hours so that you can significantly reduce how much money you spend. Now, let me quickly break down all of the financial components to getting charging stations in your building. There is the shared infrastructure, which would be the ownership of the shared facilities. And the idea here is that as a condominium in Ontario, you have the obligation to provide the residents access to charging. This changed in 2018 with what we call the right to charge, which basically gives a resident the right to be able to charge their vehicle in the building. So as a condominium board, you are obligated to give them the response within 60 days of how you're going to give them access. And in legal terms, they use the word access, which is open to interpretation as well as the different variables within every building. So access could mean installing charging stations in the visitor parking, which is a pretty clean and simple solution. But as some of you may know, there may not be a surplus of visitor parking spaces in the building. Therefore, we cannot allocate them to this new purpose. So for a lot of buildings in Ontario, from what I see, is that their only option is to allow private residents to install charging stations in their private parking spaces, which then begs the question, how are they going to get power to that parking space? So the obligation of the condo board is to provide them means to access. And practically what this looks like is picture a big electrical panel that individual residents will pay to hook up to. But the ownership of that panel is the shared facilities in the condo board. So the decision-making process with the condo board has to look at, if we're looking at potentially allocating future budget dollars, what is our approach and what path are we going to go down to for our unique building constraints to allow electric circuits to be run from our electrical room or a central area in the parking garage to each and every interested resident's parking space. I'm just going to pause here. I saw a couple questions come up that might be relevant. In respect to the amount of energy that an electric vehicle charger consumes, that'll be dependent on a number of things, mainly the vehicle. Different vehicles will draw different speeds. When it comes to charging per kilowatt, that choice is up to the condominium board. And the reason is because that is coming from the main electrical service that feeds the building. So to give you a very clean example, let's say you're paying 15 cents a kilowatt from, Toronto Hydro, for example. You would want to charge the equivalent to your condominium board. And then, we have the billing mechanism to reimburse you for that. So to answer your question, Charles, the condo board is in control of what the hourly rate is. Sandra, good question. If you're going to be charging your vehicle overnight, if you have a unit owner that works nights, great, that's fine. They can still charge the vehicle during the day. But my point there was the sum of all the residents in the building tend to suggest most charging happens in the evening. So for this particular person that works nights and it has to sleep during the day, their vehicle can also charge during the day.
Thomas, there's another question in the chat about townhouse corporations and charging stations. What's your thoughts on how they should be looking at installing? What are the things they should be thinking about? Is it different than high rises?
Yes, townhouses are a bit of a different scenario, and it's hard for me to give you a general blanket approach because it'll come down to the layout of the building and where power is being delivered. There are cases where the parking garage has enough power for us to give everybody a charging station, or there could be some scenarios where the power has to be pulled from the individual unit owners. So unfortunately, without looking at the building, I can't give you an exact approach. And so I'm just, as I'm reading here, I'm trying to see some of these questions and if I can address them.
There's another townhouse complex question. Every unit has their own garage. They take care of their own needs regarding electric vehicles. Is that something you're seeing?
Yeah, I have seen a number of projects where if they do have their own garage, the electrical panel is usually within range of their garage and they can install one off of their unit panel and clean and easy. I have seen those cases. Like I said, townhouses can range. Sometimes you have a shared garage above the row of homes. So it will depend on that particular development. But my overall theme here and how it ties to the finances, there are typically a number of decisions that the condo board needs to kind of write in stone before you take forward the path of getting quotes from installers and mapping out an approach for the residents. The approach that we try and urge to avoid is doing it on a resident by resident basis, because often what happens is you dig yourself a bit of a hole. Technically speaking, you'll reach a point where it might be the fifth resident that you cannot install an EV charger because of certain limitations on the electrical side. So my take home point here is now is the time to be having the conversation within the board and, hopefully bring in someone educated in the space, whether it's your local electrician or it's a company like ours, to give you a picture of what makes the most sense technically for the building. And then you can work to a budget after the fact. And this budget doesn't have to be something for 2023. It could be something you're looking to spend 2024, 2025. But at least you have a order of magnitude that you can play within, that you can start to bring up at your annual board meetings. And the idea here is that you'll be bringing this up to your residents, and over time you will start to get a pool of drivers or residents who are saying, I am interested to buy a vehicle in 2024, 2025. So for every year how many vehicles you can expect in the building, which influences that CapEx spend upfront.
All right, Thomas, I think I'm going to cut you off there because we're running out of time. There's a couple more questions in the chat, and you can answer those in the chat box, and people can watch the chat box for your answers. And if we have some extra time at the end, we'll try and come back to them. Also want to let people know that we are planning our 2023 educational series. And one of the things that's going to be in our programming is the intensive director's course in April. And we are actually going to do a special 2-hour segment on electrical vehicle charging stations during the intensive director's course. So if this is something that you want some more information about, be sure to check out our director's course, which is coming up in April. But there's definitely a clear message coming through our speakers. And in order to be richer than you think, there's a lot of planning that has to take place. And that allows you to perhaps get a little bit of a leg up on the finances. All right, so speaking of utilities, let's now jump over to Ephram, who's going to talk to us about submetering and how you can control those utility costs. Ephram?
Great, thanks, Sonja. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's see what we can do about making submetering a little bit exciting, and maybe shedding some light on something that's been around for the better part of 40 years, but still seems to be an item that folks are just either not comfortable with, don't really understand it fully, don't understand how it works. So hopefully I'll be able to explain some of that at a high level. And of course, we can continue the conversation at any time. So like I said, submetering, specifically in Canada, has been around for the better part of 40 years. The Greater Toronto Area and in Ontario specifically, we're kind of on the forefront, which surprises some folks. You know, when we're chatting about what submetering is and what we do and how we get involved, people would have thought that the West Coast or BC would have kind of been leading the charge just with the green efforts that are going on in that region. But the reality is that Ontario really was at the forefront of submetering, specifically electricity submetering, over the course of the past couple of decades, specifically in 2009 or 2010, when it was mandated that specifically in new construction, metering, specifically electricity metering, was mandated in a building. So with that being said, what is submetering? The best way that we can describe it is that it is essentially a pay-per-use model. So right now, we saw budgets and we saw allocations for maintenance fees, and within those maintenance fees, chances are that there's an allocation of that, a portion to utility costs. I think it was Blair mentioning earlier on that utility rates are spiking. That's true. Specifically electricity, we have seen double-digit spikes in electricity over the course of at least the past couple of years. We in the industry don't see that stopping. Maybe it'll slow down a little bit, but it's still going to keep increasing. And we know that maintenance fees can't necessarily increase at the same rate that the utility is increasing. So what do? Potentially submetering is an option, and we'll get into more details in a second. We believe submetering is fair. And the reason why we believe submetering is fair as an industry is because we are not just, or you as a condo, the condo is simply not just allocating a portion of the utility bill by square footage or by bedroom or whatever the case may be. Again, people are actually paying for what it is that they're using to the kilowatt. And we can get into those details in a second. And then third, and something that we all care about specifically at Carma, but within the industry at all, we want our kids to be able to breathe and to not deal with these severe weather, or to at least control climate change. And by making people conscious of what it is that they're using, the pay-per-use model, we are in effect reducing overall consumption, appropriately so, reducing overall carbon footprint, and hopefully becoming a little bit more healthy. So with that being said, what services do submetering companies typically meter? Especially in condos that are existing. So typically in a condo retrofit, as we call it, we are taking a look at electricity only. Water is an option, and we'll get into that in a second. So we will typically show up on site, do a site audit. We'll take a look at the building's infrastructure, where the mechanical room is, where the communications are, and I would argue 9.5 out of 10 buildings that we've seen, at least in my tenure that we've seen, are a submetering candidate. So, just for frame of reference, our company would do just over 1,000 buildings across Canada, and that's a mix of condos, rentals, new construction, retrofits, whatever the case may be. And then again, I would argue that just about 100% of the time, the buildings that we enter for electricity retrofits are submetering candidates. We sometimes talk about water. Water is a little bit more difficult, and just something to keep at the back of your minds. Typically in buildings that are older, and older can be 15 years plus, the risers tend to feed more than one unit. And the problem we've got in the submetering world is because we are specifically putting a meter, a physical meter in the unit or attached to the unit, it's sometimes next to impossible to separate or to parse that riser between the variety of units. So we can take a look, and if something's being changed or if there's a major renovation happening and the walls are exposed, potentially there's an option there. But I would argue less than 50% of the time, would it be cost effective to retrofit for water? So electricity is where we're going to focus. So what options are available? Typically in a condo retrofit, the submetering provider, the third-party submetering provider like us, would typically finance the entire solution. So what does that mean? That's a fancy way of saying there's absolutely no cost to the condo corporation. So the next question, what common sense would say, well, how does a company like Carma make money? We're a for-profit business. We make money on our customer service charge, and I'll break that down in a second. The important thing to note is that it is not a one-size-fits-all. So we're a national company. We've got feet on the street in every region and municipality that we operate in. And one of the reasons why I mentioned that we will specifically do site audits. I'm sorry if you hear the background noise here. I happen to be on site right now, so I apologize if it's coming through. But one of the reasons why we do site audits is because we don't just apply template to every building that we would approach. We quite literally do a site audit, develop a submetering plan, a schematic, to make sure that everyone's on the same page, to make sure that it's cost effective, that it's something that can be implemented with little to no nuisance to the actual condo owners or occupant, and we go from there. But there are three options that are available. Again, typically in a condo retrofit, a finance solution, so no capital contribution by the condo, is probably 9.5 times out of 10 is what most condos are choosing. There is a purchased option, and there's also a hybrid, and we can get into those in a couple of seconds as well. Again, typically condos, especially existing condos where we're talking about a condo retrofit option, typically we are financing the solution over a 10 or 15-year term. So I talked a little bit before about our customer service charge. One of the values that I think we bring to the table is that as opposed to dealing with the utility, we actually have live people at the end of the phone number. So because of the way we're set up, not only is there someone who's responsible for the overall building from a strategic account executive perspective, there's also an onboarding specialist that will make sure that if the condo has 100 units, that we are training and onboarding those 100 units or 100 occupants appropriately, and then over the term and course of the agreement, to make sure that the occupants, if they have a question, we're there to answer, that we're being proactive about things that are potentially going wrong, and we go from there. What we typically find in a newly submetered building, there's actually two things that we find. So we know that in the first year of a newly submetered building, going from non-submetered to submetered, we typically see savings of anywhere between 35 to 40%. So let me say that one more time. So in the first year, there's typically a savings of 35 to 40% in the overall consumption of electricity in that building. Why? Because people are all of a sudden more conscious of what it is that they're using. They're responsible for their specific unit. They're not, subsidizing their neighbor or being allocated a certain amount of cents per square foot. They're actually paying for what they use. So if someone leaves their lights on all the time, they're going to pay for it. Their neighbor's not going to pay for it. If someone likes to, be colder and potentially turns the air conditioning up, they are going to pay for it versus it being allocated equally across by square footage across all the units. Companies like ours make our money on the customer service charge. So the electricity is the electricity. It's flow through. We are regulated under the Ontario Energy Board. We're also mandated by Measurement Canada federally. You are not allowed to make money on the consumption or on the commodity. In our case, we're specifically talking about electricity. So we put a meter in. If someone uses 10 or 20 or 100 kilowatts of electricity, that's exactly what they are getting charged for. And then we are charging an admin fee to essentially manage that account over the term of the agreement, including potentially us financing the solution over the term. So again, before we talked about a no capital contribution, we obviously have to recuperate the capital that we're putting into the building. We're putting meters in, we're putting infrastructure in. That capital is recovered by that admin fee. We still feel there's value in that admin fee, not only to the condo corp, but to the occupant. Our admin fees tend to come in lower than what the local utilities are charging, number one. Number two, we actually do believe that our customer service is second to none. And number three, the days of having metering rooms in the basements of buildings are gone from our perspective. So what do I mean by that? So, typically in an older building, you would have a meter room in the basement. If the building has 200 or 300 units, that meter room would have 200 or 300 meters taking up valuable real estate, in the basement of the building. We use something called smart meters, multi-point meters. Each one of our meters, which is basically, or meter boxes, which is basically twice the size, of your laptop, can manage up to 18 units. We take up a small footprint. We typically put that box in a communications closet or a mechanical room on every second floor next to the elevator. And that's essentially where things happen. There's a current transformer, and I apologize for getting a little bit too technical. It's essentially, in the industry, they call it a donut. And we are essentially measuring the flow of that unit so that unit owner, that occupant, is again getting charged for exactly what it is that they're using. Any questions come up, they can call us or their account manager. And the other benefit of being put on a termed agreement is that it's one less thing for the condo corporation, for the building to have to worry about over the course of the next 10 years. Because that building would be on a 10-year agreement with us, as an example, over the course of that 10 years, Carma would be responsible for the service, the maintenance, anything and everything that could potentially happen to those meters is our responsibility, not the condo corporations, which is a key point. One less thing to worry about. As far as termed agreements are concerned, so we've seen typical agreements, especially in condo retrofits, at 10. We're now seeing a bit of a trend increasing to anywhere between 12 and 13 years. And a big reason for that is at year 10, under Measurement Canada, the electricity meters have to be resealed and recertified. There's a cost to that. And it's one of the things that we would talk about with a condo board, with a property manager, as we're contemplating what the best solution and options are. At year 10, the meters have to be resealed and recertified. If we create a 12 or 13-year agreement, all of a sudden that cost is borne by Carma. It's again one less thing for that condo corporation to have to worry about. Maybe some questions to ask, and then I can open up the floor. As we kind of round out some metering in 15 minutes or less, we can talk about it for hours and hours and hours. But the idea here is really just to give high level thoughts, maybe instigate some thought about what you should be considering, what works, what doesn't, the model that works, and potentially if your building, if it's not submetered, maybe this is a way to help control costs, especially as budgets are being challenged. So maybe some of the questions to ask, whether it's Carma or another provider that you're potentially chatting with, is, are the meters Measurement Canada approved? So that's a key point. When you're billing off of an electricity meter in Canada, and specifically in Ontario, under the Ontario Energy Board, the meters have to be Measurement Canada approved in order to be able to do that legally. We've been building our own meters. Carma has for the better part of 40 years. We build them at our manufacturing facility in Lindsay, Ontario. So everything's built. It's designed, manufactured and built in Canada, in Lindsay, and we supply our network across Canada and multinationally as well. We didn't spend too much time on water. Water is becoming the new fire, and it's becoming a challenge, and it's entering a lot more conversations, especially with insurance rates spiking. If water it can be contemplated in your building, the big question to ask is the meter brass fitted versus plastic? So as a rule, we converted to using brass fitted meters 3 years ago. The industry I'm not sure everyone else is, the industry as a whole was for the most part using plastic meters. The challenge with the plastic water meters is that during installation, everyone likes to give things an extra crank to make sure they're tight, but you don't realize there's a crack or fracture in the unit until real water starts to flow through. That only happens obviously when we turn the water back on, and that's when the real problems happen. With a brass fitted meter, the chances of that happening are slim to none. Another question to potentially ask is, can the submetering bill incorporate other items? So those other items, Thomas talked to us about EV charging. Those other items could be EV charging. We've got the ability, if a unit has an EV charger associated to it, we've got the ability to integrate that as part of the one bill, meaning that occupant, instead of getting a bill for, EV charging, a bill for security potentially, and a bill for submetering, we have the ability to amalgamate that all under one bill, one throat to choke. It's potentially a little bit easier for that occupant to manage. Just another selling feature. Is the call center local? Is another question that's important. Can I get local help? So with us, it's twofold. Again, I mentioned before, we've got techs and project managers that are local. We work where we live. If something does happen, chances are we are getting out to site that day. Worst case, next day. We work essentially on a 24-hour clock, especially if something major is going on. And, if something can happen at 11 o'clock at night or 4 o'clock in the morning, just like it can at 11 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We can generally get to site within a couple of hours. Our call center happens to be, again, based in where our innovation center is in our manufacturing facility in Lindsay, Ontario. We have a 16-seat call center. Generally, we are answering calls within 25 seconds and getting people on and off with their day within about 2 or 3 minutes. And the important point there is people generally call, not to say thank you, you're doing a great job, but they generally call if they have an issue or they're confused. And we are generally, and the first person that answers the phone is empowered to generally, for the most part, answer any question they may have, make sure they're comfortable with things before they get on with their day.
Ephram, I'm gonna have to jump in here because we're running out of time, but those are all good considerations and good questions that people should be asking when they're looking at the submetering. And back to our comment about can you be richer than you think? Obviously, if you can save 35 to 40% in your energy costs by changing the way you pay for energy, that's a great way to put some more money back in everyone's pocket. All right, so we promised that we would have a surprise speaker if we had some time, and we do have a little bit of time left. And so I don't know, somebody give me a drum roll or something, but we've got Michelle Farley here from FCS Fire Consulting Services. Michelle's a member of our board of directors, and she's going to talk to you about something she's been experiencing lately. And her recommendation to get this line item into your budgets. So Michelle, take it away.
Okay, because you can be richer than you think if you don't end up spending money responding to fire department orders or fines. But all buildings will primarily be inspected by the fire department in 2023. Will you be ready? There's been a spike in the number of residential fires that has put an unprecedented amount of pressure on fire departments to keep us all safe. The fire departments are performing more inspections than ever, while the fine amounts in Ontario have increased substantially. At the same time, most property managers and condo boards are not getting more than a day or two notice to be ready prior to that inspection. This means that there has never been a better time to invest in your building's fire safety culture, particularly if you have any budget whatsoever left from 2022. Not sure how to invest it? Here's a few ideas. A building auditor assessment before the fire department arrives. If you haven't looked at your life safety systems over the last few years, you'll almost certainly have several things that need to be addressed. This could include small things like building residents propping doors open or they're not latching properly, electrical rooms being too cluttered, or even larger problems like mechanical or electrical systems and issues from doors to elevators and other equipment within your building. Find them now before they turn into a fine later. Train and retrain your staff. Your staff are the ones that are taking care of your regular inspections and maintaining your documentation. More importantly, they are the ones that need to know exactly how to act and respond in an emergency situation. When was the last time your staff was trained on fire safety and their roles and responsibilities? How many employees have come and gone since you've had your training? Get your staff trained as soon as possible. Teach them how to properly maintain high fire code standards so they can train the next wave of building employees. And update your fire safety plan. Did you know that your fire safety plan by law has to be reviewed annually? It also has to be amended to include any changes in the building that impact that fire safety plan. Keeping this up to date as possible will keep your building as safe and compliant as possible. So, how do you make this happen before 2023? If you're worried that you simply don't have the time to call a consultant or schedule an assessment or arrange a site visit before December 31st, don't worry, you don't have to. If you have budget left over, you can issue a purchase order from 2022 and arrange to do the actual work in 2023 at that time, if that works for you. That being said, don't leave it too long. It's important to remember that we can't simply show up on a Monday and your building will be fully compliant by Tuesday. Some of the changes you may need to make will take time. If you can't start right away, make it your biggest priority for the new year. Set yourself up for an amazing 2023. Add a budget line item for fire code audits and training, and keep your building and your people safe. Thank you.
All right, Michelle. And I guess the question is, what's a reasonable number to put in that budget line? What should people be budgeting? How much?
That's a really good question. It really depends on the size and the scope of your building. So townhouses obviously would be generally quite a bit less. It can be anywhere from about $900 to $3,000, depending on how large your building is, how much staff you have, how much training would be involved.
Okay, thanks. All right. So I think we're coming to the end. I'm going to do a very rapid fire through the panel. If anybody wants to sort of leave us with your last thoughts on how we can be richer than we think. Let's start with whoever's first in my picture. So Blair, we're going to start with you. Any last comments? You're still muted, Blair.
I had one in mind, and of course I didn't write it down, so I'll circle around to the end.
Okay, Ryan?
Thanks, Sonia. Yeah, look, I mean, I think that financial challenges are just going to be more common today. And to play off of some of what was in the chat there, it's about how you manage it with your community. So making sure that you're being transparent with your owners, making sure that you are bringing them a well thought out plan, that you're not surprising the last minute with these things. I think it'll make a big difference in terms of how you manage it through your community. I don't know you can avoid some type of financial challenge today. I think all these communities are going to have it. But it's about being transparent, communicating with your owners will help you navigate through it and earn the trust of your owners through that process.
Thanks, Ryan. Thomas?
I think from my perspective, I just see it as being able to understand and make decisions around the upcoming trends regarding the building. In this case, I'm referring to the electric vehicles and the emergence of electrification for our transportation needs. It's coming to every building, and my biggest recommendation is if we plan things well in advance, we usually can save quite a significant amount of money.
Thanks. Ephram?
I would say whether it's Carma or another company that you're considering going with a submetering program, the questions we talked about are important, making sure they can service what they sell, making sure that there's local folks. And then again, especially in a condo retro, the one point I didn't cover is who's actually doing the installation. So in our world, it's our own crew that's doing it, so we can control the quality and the process and the communication. If it's outsourced, it might become another issue. So that is definitely another question to ask as you're contemplating it for your specific building.
Thanks. Blair, did you remember what you were thinking before?
Oh, who knows? But actually, just listening to everyone else's comments, I think there's two things. One is don't put things off. I think the more you put things off as far as the decision goes and gathering information, just drives up the cost of what your ultimate task is going to be. And do a risk-based look at everything when you're maybe in your annual budgeting process. And that would cover, a lot of things that everyone sort of talked about, upcoming opportunities, risk and opportunities. So with regards to, submetering, electric vehicles is a lot of people think that, well, that's just something more for me to do, but if there's an opportunity there as well to maybe increase value of the units, right? If you have that in place and your neighbor doesn't. And the other risk is, Michelle talked about is, what if scenarios. And if you don't cover those off, you won't be sleeping as well at night.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. I also want to take this opportunity to once again thank our sponsors. We can't do it without you, and we really appreciate your support. So thank you to Common Ground Condo Law, McIntosh Perry, Bayshore Property Management, Aaliyah Associates, and MCRS Property Management for all of your support and making these webinars available for all of our viewers to see. Just a couple of reminders. Don't forget our next webinar is December 9th, and this is our case law update, our annual case law update. Come join the group of lawyers who are going to be bringing cases to life, letting you know what the courts and the tribunals have been saying in 2022. It's from 12 to 1:30 on December 9th. Also, we have finalized, as I said before, our education program from January to June 2023. So mark these in your calendar. There will be more information on our website and an ability to register on the website. So you can go there. But January 20th, February 17th, March 24th, May 12th, and June 16th. Those are the dates of our webinars for the January to June series. We are going to be changing our webinar format from a 1.5 hour format to a 1 hour format come 2023. So our webinars will be going from 12 to 1. Also, don't forget to mark your calendar for the director's course, April 22nd and 23rd. It will be offered online again this year, and it's a 2-day intensive director's course. And there is a free Intro to Condos course that we're going to be presenting on February 1st. From 7 to 9 p.m. This course is open to directors, potential directors, and more importantly, owners. So if you're a member of a board of directors, feel free to share the information with your owners and invite them to come and see this webinar. A well-educated owner base makes it much easier to manage your condo. So details about that will be on our website. Also, a recording of today's webinar will be posted sometime next week. Don't forget to join us on Facebook. If you're not on our email list, send an email to admin@ccihuronia.com to be added to our list. And stay tuned and make sure that you follow us on our website, ccihuronia.com, for upcoming events. Follow us on Facebook. And also follow some of our other chapters in Ontario. And here's a highlight of some of the events that are going on in some of our other chapters. CCI Golden Horseshoe has a session on November 22nd called Holiday Headaches. You can go to cci-ghc.ca for more information. CCI Eastern Ontario, those are our friends in Ottawa, have a session on guidelines for reserve fund studies and performance studies coming up. So you can go to cci-easternontario.ca for information about that. And CCI Grand River chapter on December 16th has a year in review, legal panel, and luncheon. This is an in-person event, but you can get more information at cci-grc.ca. So until next time, I'm Sonja Hodis from the entire CCI family to yours. Have a great weekend. I hope we're going to be seeing you on December 9th as we bring cases to life. And don't forget, CCI is your condo connection.